Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Copeland, your host. Thanks for joining our Healthy Place Facebook Live today. We're also simulcasting on the Healthy Place YouTube channel, so I want to welcome everyone there too. The topic of today's show is surviving a loved one's suicide. What is it like to be left behind? I know the topic is an especially sensitive one for a lot of people. So I just want to remind you if there's a possibility that you might be triggered by what we're discussing, please think about it and take care of yourself. Before we start, we're looking for your questions or comments, so type them into the chat box and we'll get to those shortly as the show proceeds. Also, if you are looking for detailed information on suicide, depression, or any other mental health issue, you can find it on HealthyPlace.com. We'll also be putting up the number for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. It's available 24/7, not only for those who may be suicidal, but they also offer a lot of help to family members and loved ones who may have questions about how to deal with specific situations and need help or guidance. The number is 800-273-8255. And again, we'll be putting that up on the screen in just a few minutes. Our guest is Julie Halpert. Julie is a journalist and has written for major publications, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Over her 30-year career, many of her articles have focused on the mental health struggles of young people. For me, I'm very appreciative and grateful to have Julie here. As many of you know, this month, September, is National Suicide Prevention Month. It's also the month that Julie Halpert's 23-year-old son, Garrett, died by suicide 3 short years ago. Julie, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. This must be a particularly hard time for you this month.
Yes, every month is a hard time, but this is a particularly difficult time, as you can imagine, with the anniversary of his passing.
Absolutely. I want to go back to that day in 2017. It was your wedding anniversary. How did you get the news, and what was your first reaction?
I honestly don't want to go into too many details about that day. Just suffice it to say that we were told that he passed away, and our first reaction was disbelief. We never thought, even though he had been struggling, that he would do something like this. I mean, it's every parent's worst nightmare, honestly, because even if you have a child who struggles, you just can't fathom that this is something that would happen to them. And if it were in your thoughts, then you feel like you would have obviously tried to prevent it. So there's a real feeling of despair, and it's just devastating. There's no other word for it.
As I understand it, Garrett had been diagnosed with depression. He was away at college. He was getting treatment. Prior to his death, were you or any of your family members concerned about suicide? Had that possibility ever crossed your mind?
Not really. He actually had struggled periodically through the years, but since when he struggled in college, he then transferred to a college near us, the University of Michigan, did well, and then actually was in DC for the year, and then came back just before he passed away. And he'd had some struggles in the past, but nothing that would have made us think that he would do this, really.
In those early days following Garrett's suicide, what kinds of questions and thoughts went through your mind, and how were you handling them?
Not well. What immediately leaps to mind, especially for me, and I think a lot of survivors of suicide loss, is that you think, what could you have done to prevent it? You feel like you should have been able to protect your child. I mean, that's something every parent feels like they should be able to do, is to protect and watch out for their child. And so when something like this happens, you go back in time and you try to rewrite history and think, if I only did this, if I only did that, and you just ruminate and ruminate, and it really compounds the loss, because you can't. I'm a person who worries and ruminates and goes back a lot anyway, and so with something like this, it was just it really was paralyzing. And I think a lot of parents, as I reached out to others experiencing this, especially in the early days, they also they felt the same way. And then the second thing that came to mind was how can I go on? And my husband and I believe very firmly that it's not fair to our daughters for us to fall apart. We need to find a way to move forward and honor our son while still being strong for our daughters so that they don't lose. A lot of times when a child dies by suicide, the parents, the remaining siblings lose their parents too. And it's certainly understandable. And we just really wanted to try to prevent that from happening as well.
I want to preface this question by saying when it comes to mental illness, as a society, it's no surprise to you and to everybody who's watching, I'm sure, that we're not fully enlightened. We're not a very accepting society yet. And there are many family members who are left behind, and they're embarrassed, maybe even ashamed to say that their loved one died by suicide. How did you at the time and maybe even today feel about that?
I know that is the case, but not where we live. I think we are blessed by being in such an accepting, tolerant, inclusive community. And we immediately told everyone that was what was happening. We've always been upfront about whenever our children would struggle with depression, that it's something that people needed to, we weren't ashamed of it, and they shouldn't be ashamed of it. And I think I can't even imagine what it would be like to be among people who made you feel shame and made you feel like you had to hide it. I mean, when someone young passes away, sometimes I'll read the obituary and wonder if it was suicide, if it's not explicitly mentioned. And sometimes people don't mention it because they're embarrassed about it. And we have to change that. And we have been very honest and straightforward. And we have gotten nothing but support and encouragement, and really have been embraced by that decision by our community and our friends and our family. I honestly can't think of anybody I know personally who was judging us for what happened.
Boy, that is very, very fortunate.
Mm-hmm. But I understand that's not the case in all places. It wasn't the case for us.
Did you have any kind of support system at the time, and was it helpful at all?
Yes, we were very blessed that way. We are Jewish, and we did something we called sitting Shiva, which is one of the greatest traditions in Judaism, where people come for a visitation in the few days following the passing. And so in addition to having many people at the funeral, our house was just, people were in and out. We had hundreds and hundreds of people over the course of the past few days, which helped with the immediate shock and grief and trauma. And then after that, people reached out constantly. I mean, it was just a flood of concerns, handwritten letters, emails, phone calls, flowers and food sent to our door on a regular basis. And so that was something that was really helpful to us. And then I reached out to people. My husband and I joined a support group. People who lost children to suicide reached out to us. And that was really, really helpful too.
One of the things that I want to ask you is, you mentioned your husband, you mentioned your other daughters. Did you feel like you had to take care of them during this time?
Our daughters are really strong. My older daughter has a wonderful village, a wonderful community of people where she lives. She lives in rural New York. And my other daughter actually was in France studying abroad when this happened and had to come home immediately, and then returned to France and had an incredibly supportive host family she was living with, and her friends were great. We tried to be there for them as much as we could. And my husband and I just vowed that we were going to be in this together and be there for each other. And we grieved in different ways, but we weren't going to let this break us, because another casualty of suicide is often it causes parents to grieve differently, and that can cause them to grow apart. And if anything, I feel like we are stronger than ever. We are each other's rock. Nobody else can understand what we're going through but each other, and of course the girls. And so I did not feel like I wanted to be there, but I didn't feel like somebody was crumbling and I had to like not think of myself while I took care of somebody else. We're all struggling together and equally, I think.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Julie Halpert about the suicide death of her son 3 years ago, and how she's dealt with it and how she's dealing with it today. If you have a question for Julie, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we'll get to those shortly. Julie, you also mentioned, you said you had support in the early days. Many people talk about they have support in the early days, and then the people sort of fade away. Was that your experience?
To an extent. I mean, of course, our immediate family, they'll always be there for us. I mean, our immediate extended family and a couple of our close friends. I would say that, even around the first, up to like through the first year, around the first year anniversary, people were constantly reaching out. And now at this point, it's definitely less so. People move on with their lives. And I think it's also hard for people to feel the pain that you're still feeling. I don't judge people because I would be the same way if I were the one who was on the outside looking in. But it's absolutely true that I think people reach out less as time passes, for sure.
Um, and so Karen is watching the show, and she wants to know, did you ever get counseling for yourself?
Yes. Well, I had already been in and out of counseling with this, fortunately. So I had a therapist who was really great, and I went back to her and saw her pretty intensely. In addition, my husband and I highly recommend this. We joined a closed support group that was run by the Depression Center out of the university where we live, and it was run by two incredibly trained social worker facilitators. It was only about 6 of us, and we met like once a week over the course of 10 weeks. We'd all lost either a child or a sibling to suicide. And it was really helpful, really focused on sort of how to move forward, how to be resilient, what helps each other. And we did a lot of crying. And I really think there's nothing like connecting with somebody who has lost a child to suicide. It's different than losing a child in any other way. And so for us, that was super helpful. I highly recommend counseling. And, it helped me. And I think some people feel like they can handle this on their own. I think that's really hard. And I would say if you're open to it, it can be really helpful.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you. A death by suicide. When you're talking about death to other people, okay, a non-suicidal death, a lot of people can relate to that.
Sure.
So, how do you deal with that?
So, and how do you deal with
Talking to people who who have not experienced? Do you find it's different than talking to somebody who has experienced
yes.
loss of somebody? In
yes.
what way?
Well, I mean, again, when just after our son passed away, we had like 3 or 4 people who reached out to us who'd lost someone to suicide. And it was so helpful to us because you felt like, how are you surviving? You could ask them all those questions and nobody else can really understand it. I mean, people can be sympathetic to it, but you just don't know. You can't imagine it. You can't imagine it. You don't want to imagine it if it hasn't happened to you. And since I will mention later, the nonprofit we started, my husband and I are constantly getting calls from people whose young adults are either struggling severely or unfortunately sometimes who they've lost someone to suicide. And I pay it forward. It's a hard conversation for me to have, a little bit triggering, as you can imagine, but I feel like it can be so incredibly helpful to be there for each other because, only you know this pain and the pain of losing a child this way. And so you can help them just like they can help you when this happens.
Marietta's in the audience. She says, how do you deal with the question of why? As my brother committed suicide nearly 2 years ago, not leaving a note, told us constantly he's going to hang himself, but we stopped believing him. But I feel guilty because I didn't try harder, especially, trying to help.
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time going back and trying to figure out what I could have done differently. And, my husband will often say that doesn't bring him back. And you'll never know. Like, even if they left a note, even if they left, really clear breadcrumbs, you'll never know what happened in that moment of time that caused them to lose hope and just be so despairing that they did this. And so I try very hard. I'm not always successful, but I try to really live in the present moment and not go back there and just say, this happened. It was horrible. I couldn't control it. And as much as I tried, I regret it. And I've been told to turn my feelings of guilt into regret. I still feel a lot of guilt, but I think beating yourself up over something like this, you shouldn't. I mean, I say that to other people, even though I beat myself up about it still, but it's you never can possibly know what goes on in the mind of someone. And for me as a parent, I know that he must have been in so much pain, and that just makes me so sad. But you can never know the answer to that question. I don't know anybody who ever really knows. And so it's probably best to try to figure out how you can honor their memory and continue to live for those who depend on you and want you to be around.
And so Debbie, who's out in the audience, says, she's dealing with survivor guilt, much like what you were talking about. Do you ever feel like, you didn't do enough?
All the time, of course. I mean, I feel like if I did the right things, he would be here. But I'm told by my skilled my skilled therapist that you can never know if it would have made a difference. You just can't know, and so you just have to try to move forward as best you can, because going back and beating yourself up for the things that you wish you'd have done is not going to bring your child back. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And that's what I try to keep telling myself whenever I go back to that dark place, which I will do still from time to time, do it less now, because you just can't possibly know. And, a lot of these kids who they're dying this way some of them have been bullied. Some of them, they have had difficult lives, but others like ours led a generally happy life. Our son was loved by us, and he had many friends. He knew he was loved. He loved all these people. He was smart. He was athletic. He was talented. He had a great job. I mean, everything on the outside you could imagine. And yet he still felt this way. So I couldn't, you can't get in their head. You can't always know. And you can't, unfortunately, prevent this. I mean, we're working to put some support measures in place that we hope will prevent this from happening to others. But the supports that we needed for our son weren't there for us.
It's been 3 years since the death of your son. That's not really a long time at all. How are you doing today?
I'm
as
doing
compared to back then?
better. I mean, I am doing, I would say, better, just because I try to lose myself in the minutia of every day and the things that need to get done, and being strong for my husband and my kids. There's always going to be a giant hole in my heart, and I think that that will never be filled, and even joyful moments will always be tinged with they'll be bittersweet because of my son not being here. I do feel like I'm able to get through the days. Some days are better than others, but it's not the same depth of consistent pain that I felt when this happened 3 years ago, for sure.
I asked that question because, sometimes you'll hear people say time heals all wounds. And so I was wondering, is it less painful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would use the word less painful. I would say it's less oppressive, because the pain will always be there to me. This is going to define me. And that pain is just going to be a part of something I live with now. But I try to have it be with me among the other things that happen that are positive as well. Again, so that so I can be there fully present for people who need me, basically.
Dave is in the audience. He wants to know, what things do you do to cope with the emotional pain and sadness?
Sometimes I don't do this enough, but I wish I did it more. And I highly recommend just having a good cry, and not being afraid to cry wherever you are, and no matter who you're with. I also find that exercise is my friend. I was a really hardcore exerciser before this happened, and I didn't stop when it happened. It's just a way for me to release and be distracted and be in the moment, the present moment of whatever I'm doing. And I was a dancer. I took ballet classes before the pandemic, and I really lost myself in the movement and the music, and that was really helpful. I talk to friends a lot. I have a good community of friends. I go to therapy. Even helping other people through this is helpful to me. And at some point, I'd love to mention to you the nonprofit we've started, which I think is a helpful way to move forward. I think if you can help find a way to help other people, that in itself can be really, help you get through a lot of sad days, knowing that you're giving back to other people in a different way.
sometimes, you'll come across people who say ignorant or insensitive things. Have you come across that, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I've come across it, and I don't deal with it as directly as I should. A lot of people, if I don't know them, I won't mention that I lost a child because I don't want to tell this to strangers. But one person recently just like asked what happened on that day, and did you see this coming? And these are really inappropriate questions. You shouldn't be asking someone how their child died, what happened just before they died. Very personal questions. I hope nobody asks me that again. And I just said that's a really sad time for me. I'd rather not talk about that. So I usually just try to shut it down. It doesn't happen too often, but every now and again it does. Some people, I wouldn't say they're being thoughtless. I just think they don't have a clue. So again, try not to judge them, but it can be very painful for sure.
We have Dr. Norwood coming up next, but I want to give you a chance to talk about Garrett's space.
Thank you. Yes. So one of the things that my husband and I found we couldn't find for our son is that there's really no intermediate place between seeing your therapist once a week or going to the psych ER if you feel like you want to take your life. If you are actively suicidal, you absolutely should go to the ER. There's a lot of struggling young adults who are just wanting a warm, welcoming, holistically focused place that won't be stigma-inducing, just like there is for drug rehab. And that doesn't exist for, at least in our community and in many communities, for mental health. So we started Garrett Space, and that's GARRETTSS. PACE.org, which is intended to build, our goal is to build a residential treatment center for young adults that will be warm, like a welcoming retreat. It'll be situated in nature. We'll have all kinds of ways to teach them healthy living and resilience, like help for dealing with broken relationships, help for families. We hope to teach them yoga and meditation, music, journaling, poetry, all the kinds of things that our son loved and that we feel young adults could really benefit from. We're going to also have a lot of peer-to-peer support. So young adults can see that they're not alone in their struggles. Our son really felt that he was very much alone and that there was something wrong with him. It's very normal to struggle. And we want young adults to be brought together in an environment where they can heal. And prior to opening the center, we're going to be rolling out some programming in another space that will be movement, peer-to-peer support, and a social catch-up. Again, just to bring these young adults together so that they can understand everybody goes through these kind of tough times. Help is available, and you can rebound from this and you can heal. And honestly, being involved in Garrett Space, while it's been very hard to revisit this issue and deal with people who are struggling, I would say, and I'm sure my husband would say, it's been really helpful to us as a way to really move forward. I mean, I feel like we failed our son, and we want to prevent others from taking their lives because of this.
That's a beautiful thing. Would you mind taking one more question?
Sure.
Great. Pamela wants to know, how do you respond when you meet someone new and they ask, how many children do you have?
I get this. I ask this question all the time. I think the best advice I got was that it depends on the person. Like sometimes, as I said, I don't want to tell strangers I had a son who passed away, but I think one thing I've been told that really is the most, that would work best for me, and it's very personal, is I have 3 children and 1 passed away. And, hopefully they'll leave it at that. And it's your call as to whether to tell them how they died. I don't think that strangers need to know that. Sometimes people will say things like, I have 3 children, 1 is in my heart. I think it just whatever works for you. And if you feel like you don't want to tell them that you had a child that died, that's your personal prerogative. But it's just very individualistic. I think it's the hardest question anybody could ask you. And I don't have a good answer for it, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Julie, for coming on today and talking with us.
Sure.
If anything, I'm sure there are people watching who feel a little bit less alone today.
I hope so. It's a hard thing to go through, and you just have to hold on and know that you matter and your life matters too. So get the support you can.
Thank you again.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Our next guest coming up in just a second is Dr. Kristie Norwood. And if you're just joining us, welcome to the HealthyPlace Facebook Live. We have been talking to Julie Halpert about her life after the suicide of her 23-year-old son, Garrett, in September 2017. And now we're going to bring on our next guest, licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Kristie Norwood. Dr. Norwood is the Director of Student Counseling Center at Hampton University, and she also sees clients in a private practice. I appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Norwood. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me and creating this space for such an important.
You know something? I'm not hearing you. Let me just check. Okay. Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
No, I'm still not hearing you. Well, let me ask. You can hear me, correct?
I can. How's that?
Great. Let me ask you a question, and then I can get your sound to come on up back here. You heard what Julie Halpert had to say. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind about what she had to say?
Yeah, are you able to hear me? Hmm. Is that better? Can you hear me?
I, the audience can hear you. I can't hear you. So please go ahead. I'm wondering,
Okay,
you can hear me? Please go
I
ahead
can.
and tell us what you thought about is there anything that stood out about what Julie had to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a lot that stood out about what Julie said. I think one of the pieces that she said is that she continues to carry that pain with her, that even though you find ways to find meaning in your life, that you continue to carry that pain and that loss with you. And so that over time, while it may, some days it might be a little bit easier, that pain is still with you. And she used a really strong word. She described it as oppressive, which I think is a really strong and likely an accurate word for how someone would feel in trying to find a way to deal with that kind of loss.
Um, for survivors, those people, family members, loved ones left behind after a suicide, is there a risk that in their pain and grief over the loss of their loved one, that they too may see suicide as an option?
Yeah, that can happen, depending on their belief system, also their faith system. Some people believe I want to join this loved one, right? I want to be with them. Or sometimes, as Julie sort of spoke to, that pain and that grief becomes so heavy and becomes so unbearable that it's sort of like I can't bear this, and so I'm not gonna continue to move forward. And so those tend to be two of kind of the main reasons people want to join that loved one. They want to sort of see that person again, or the level of pain, the level of grief feels too much to bear, and they feel too alone in the process that they then just decide that then that suicide might be the way for them to not have to deal with the pain any longer.
The stigma surrounding mental health and suicide is very real. There are people who don't believe that counseling or therapy can help them. Their attitude may be, what am I going to get by just talking to a counselor? And I'd like you to address that, please.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things you're able to do is start the process of figuring out how do I feel, right? So, Julie was so fortunate. She talked about her community and how much support she garnered. And I would say not everyone is that fortunate in terms of the support. And so sometimes it can be really helpful just to sort of figure out loud, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? And then to talk through the grief. We know, science says, research says that when we internalize our thoughts and emotions, it could lead to more depression. It could potentially lead to suicide. And so by seeking mental health care, you're able to have an opportunity to be able to talk through the grief and also to talk through the guilt. I think Julie spoke a little bit about her process. And, I think a lot of families deal with the residual guilt. Should I have done something else? Could I have done something else? Did I see the warning signs? And being able to talk with someone who's not part of your family can also be really healing, right? Because, my husband might say one thing to me, but my therapist, I don't have to see that person every day, right? They're completely neutral. And they can also help me gain the skills so I can start the process of being able to answer some of the questions from the public or not have to, hide the fact that I lost a son or a daughter or a child or a loved one to suicide. And so it can be such a difficult process in terms of seeking mental health care, but it can be so, I think, as Julie sort of showed us, it can allow us an opportunity to be able to, as she's doing with Garrett Space, to build something that can help other young adults, or just to be able to start the process of healing.
Sandy's in the audience, and I know it's perfectly normal to grieve over the loss of a loved one. She wants to know, when should a person or their family members be concerned that this is more than grief? What should they be looking for? Are there any signs?
Yeah, so I think some of the classic signs of depression you want to sort of look for, because grief can also sort of look like depression. And when depression happens for long periods of time, that's when potentially it can become problematic. And so you want to look for, is somebody not engaging in the activities that they usually do? Are they no longer, I know we're in the midst of COVID, but are they no longer going to work? Or are they no longer logging on virtually to go to work? Are they no longer caring for themselves physically? Are they not eating? Are they not sleeping? Are they starting to give items away, right? Are they starting to sort of engage in reckless behavior where for them it feels like, life is not worth living? Is this behavior sort of going on for extended periods of time? Now that looks different for everyone, but if we had to put some time parameters on it, what I would say is, if that behavior persists for any more than 2 to 3 weeks, then probably it's a little bit more than grief. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily depression, but it may require the assistance of a mental health clinician to be able to at least help that person work through that process.
Finally, and I think this is very important, if you're fortunate enough after a death, you'll have family members and friends, etc., around to support you. Some people may offer support for a week or a month, but it's probably not realistic to believe that they'll offer a huge level of support over months or years. It may even turn out that, emotionally or time-wise, they just couldn't deal with it anymore. Where else can someone find support?
Yeah, so I think, outside of the family, as Julie sort of said, you can look at your village and whatever that looks like for you, whether she identified herself as part of the Jewish faith community. So if you have a faith community, that can be helpful. If you have extended family members and also friends can be helpful. Some people do not have that sort of network, or they don't feel safe enough when something like this happens. And so that's when formal mental health care can be really useful. I also think, some of the resources, so the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, even, as you mentioned, I'm here in the Student Counseling Center. And so I think some of those sorts of resources can also be helpful to be able to go online and chat with, other young adults that I know are dealing with depression, or to be able to find a support group in my community where I know other moms have lost loved ones or have lost children to suicide can be so powerful, right? It's that idea that I don't want to feel alone. I don't want to have to feel like I'm sort of a fish out of water. And so you can go online to some of those resources. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline, I think, is a wonderful amazing resource that's out there that's available. And NAMI is a wonderful resource. Obviously, HealthyPlace is available. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. These are just different resources that are available that can also help connect you with support groups if you don't have people that are part of your own community that you feel like you can connect to and talk through about what's going on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Norwood. Yeah, you can find Dr. Norwood on Facebook at Dr. Kristie Norwood. And thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for all you're doing.
That concludes our Facebook Live today, and thank you to everybody and to all our YouTube viewers too. We're glad you joined us. For trusted, detailed information on all aspects of mental health, symptoms, treatments, whether you're looking for self-help tools or relationships and more, I hope you'll visit HealthyPlace.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another Facebook Live, and I hope to see you then.